On to Shem. Okay. Shem, it says in Genesis 10, verse 21, and children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Eber is the father of the Hebrews. So we're going to refer to Hebrews often. In Scripture, Abraham is the very first person called a Hebrew. And from that point forward, many times when people were referring to the nation of Israel, they called them Hebrews. So I want you to think, when you hear Hebrew, think Israel. They are synonymous throughout Scripture. Here is the geography of Shem again to remind us. This particular map limits Shem primarily to the Arabian Peninsula, Middle East, what we call today the Middle East. Know that his territory includes modern-day Saudi Arabia, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, southeastern Turkey. So, but again, there are other maps that show his territory going into Asia as well. In Peninsula, look at how close that is to the African continent as a whole. And what I'm trying to get across is that they occupied the same territory. They were always intermingling with each other, just on a geographic level, and then we're going to go into how they intermingled with each other on many levels. Really and truly, because of that geographic proximity, there was a perpetual presence of Hebrews within the continent of Africa. Perpetual. Never a time when they weren't there. And if you don't know that now, by the end of this presentation, you will know. We're going to go into detail. I'll try to go do it quickly, but just know, Israel, Hebrews, they always had a presence in what we call the African continent. I'm just going to give you a few examples. We know that they often visited Egypt. Abraham went down there when he was called out of his hometown in Babylon, the city of Ur. Joseph ended up down there, and we know that when there was a famine in their land, they went down to Egypt. So it was very common throughout Scripture for Hebrews to run down to Egypt, especially when they were in trouble. Second, we know that Joseph actually reigned in Egypt, so they didn't just go to Egypt for help. There was a time when a Hebrew actually reigned over Egypt. So here you have a Hebrew monarch for all intents and purposes within Africa. What was that? Okay. And then also, Hebrews were not just in Egypt. They were in other parts of Africa too. At the time of the kings, before Israel separated from Judah, some believe that an independent Israelite nation arose in Abyssinia due to the relationship between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Abyssinia is an Ethiopian empire that included northern Somalia, Djibouti, southern Egypt, eastern Sudan, Yemen, and western Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's what Abyssinia is. They say, a lot of historians say it, and also the Ethiopians themselves in their traditional history say that the Queen of Sheba had a son by King Solomon. And when he was of age, she sent him to live with his dad back in Judah, okay? Well, Israel, because they were not separated yet. So just think of Israel as a whole, a unified nation. She sent him back. Solomon anointed him and crowned him king of Abyssinia in the temple. Then he returned to Abyssinia, taking with him doctors of the law, and he took one from each tribe back with him. He also took Azarias, the son of Zadok the priest, and a copy of Torah. All right? And all of the nation converted to the Hebrew faith, and the whole nation modeled itself after Israel. Now, the Abyssinian Empire spanned from East Africa across the Red Sea into Arabia, and it was a Jewish nation until the Muslim invasion. It converted to Christianity, but it was also taken over by Muslims. But for a long time, it was a Jewish, Hebrew, Torah-keeping nation. All right? Now, traditional Ethiopian history says that the Queen of Sheba was a Jew before she even met Solomon. That's what they say. And they also record that the nation as a whole converted to Christianity. And unfortunately, when they did that, they persecuted a lot of the Hebrews who wanted to stay faithful to their original faith and keep Torah. And because of it was really bad persecution. You can look up on YouTube videos of it where they were living in poverty, they were segregated, sometimes they weren't allowed to go to school. And because of that deep persecution, those Ethiopian Jews, many of them chose to escape. They wanted to leave their native land, and many of them dwell in Israel today, and they are known as the Falashas. So when you hear Falashas, know that those are Ethiopian Jews. But before they got to Israel, they were just keeping straight Torah. They didn't know about the Talmud, didn't keep that. They were just according to the book.
What does Falasha mean?
I actually do not know what the word Falasha means.
Derogatory term.
What?
Is it derogatory?
Is it it's a derogatory term. And just to back this up, one of the reasons, I don't want to go into detail, but not everybody can just roll up in Israel and become a citizen. Let me just put it that way. You have to be able to prove some connection to the original people. That's what they say. So modern Israel based their acceptance of the Ethiopian Jews on a 9th century. I don't think I have it with me, but I'll just say what I do remember. There was I believe it was from the 9th century, a Jew known as Eldad Danny. Ben Danny, does anybody remember his name? Anyway, he's from the tribe of Dan. He said the Ethiopians were from the tribe of Dan as well. And he claimed that from a long, long time ago. And some high rabbi in Israel actually agreed and believed. And so that's why they allowed the Falashas to come, live in Israel as 100% Jews.
Literally means wanderer.
Falasha means wanderer. Thank you very much. So I just want you to know there are ancient sources that back up this whole Ethiopian story. And then, if we didn't know anything else, it's in Scripture as well. Acts chapter 8, verse 27 says, 27 through 30 says, and he arose and went, this is talking about the Ethiopian eunuch, and he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, an eunuch of great authority, under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship. And on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. Do you understand what you are reading? Philip asked. I underlined some of the text there to point out a few things. Here you have an official from the Ethiopian nation. Number one, he was an official. And notice again, queens were still reigning in Ethiopia at that time. Why did he come to Jerusalem? To worship. Know that Israelite men were commanded to come up at least 3 times a year for the feast. He had to come. He came up to worship. It wouldn't make sense for him to come to Jerusalem to worship unless he was one of those people, right? Okay, second, he's in the chariot reading the book of Isaiah. Why would he be reading Hebrew scriptures unless he himself was a Hebrew? And what language do you think the Isaiah was written in? Hebrew. Okay, and so he's reading it loud enough, Philip hears him reading it, understands what he's saying, and he says, do you understand what you're reading? He was not saying, do you understand the language? Do you understand what you're reading from a spiritual perspective? I've read this scripture so many times growing up because they were all excited that a black man got baptized. And then it's finally when I got some truth, I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, he was one of them. That's the only thing that makes this whole thing make sense. So, and then we know, yes, he got baptized and took back the good news of the Messiah back to the nation. All right. Now, I talked about the geographic closeness of Ham and Shem. Well, as often is the case, they mixed up. They often got with each other. They often married each other and produced offspring that then became part of the nation of Israel. So we're going to see that in certain scriptures. We know about it from the geography. And then also we're going to see that there are children or descendants of Shem that have the name, and the same names show up as descendants of Ham. Coincidence? I think not. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is, again, nobody disputes that Ham was black. We'll get to Shem in a minute, but nobody doubts that Ham was black. So even if we wanted to say Shem was something else and Ham was black, well, guess what? When they got together and they had all these kids, they were black too. All right? So quickly, I'm going to run through it. We know that Abraham, after Sarah, well, actually, while he was with Sarah, he married Hagar, who was an Egyptian. And Keturah, it doesn't say exactly that she was a black woman, but we can deduce that she was from a number of scripture. Let me just make sure I'm on the right. Well, what is an Arab? Okay. So, if you want to look it up, because I need to keep going, but Abraham and Hagar, you'll see in Genesis chapter 16 and verse 3, Hagar is referred to as an Egyptian, a black woman, all right? And then Abraham and Keturah. I want you to pay attention to the names of their children. One is Jokshan, and this is from Genesis chapter 25. I'm sorry, people online, you can't see it, but just trust me here. And they also, from Abraham and Keturah, came Jokshan, and then Sheba and Dedan. So let me ask, if Abraham was a Hebrew from the line of Shem, and these his descendants, they were Hebrews from the line of Shem as well, correct? Okay. All right. Noted in the table of nations, Genesis 10, verse 7, among the sons of Cush, Sheba and Dedan. Okay, same names. Here again, we go back Genesis 10, verse 25. To Eber were born two sons, and we get to his grandson, Joktan. Again, Jokshan, Joktan. Those of us who really delve in and you look at the root and all that stuff, you're going to see sometimes they have different spellings, but it's the same name. All right? And then you see down below, the sons of Joktan was named Sheba. So appearing in both Shem's line and Ham's line. Again, it just makes sense. Look at how close they were. All they had to do was hop on a boat. Or walk across the top. Very, very easy to do. Okay? The land of Havilah on the map, if you were close enough, you could see that Havilah appears both on the African continent and on the Arabian continent, right across the sea. And Sheba as well. There's a land dedicated to Sheba and a land dedicated to Havilah, and they occupy both the African continent and the Arabian Peninsula. So again, here we see the sons of Cush, Havilah, and let me skip back, Joktan from the line of Shem. So again, just these names. Let me skip through. Other examples of intermingling of Shem and Ham. Ishmael married a black woman. That's in Genesis 21:21. Esau married two black women. That's Genesis 28, verses 8 and 9. Moses, we all know he married an Ethiopian woman because he got in trouble for it. That's Numbers 12, verse 1. And Joseph was given an Egyptian wife when he assumed the throne, and that's Genesis 41. Sisters, you were hot stuff. The patriarchs really, really liked them some black women. So, just pointing that out. You said nothing's changed? Just pointing out, because so many of us we don't like how we look. We try to change it so much to look like other folk. We didn't have to do any of that back then. They really, really liked us. And these were like kings, men ruling over us. They really liked us. So, just And